Hello and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I am joined by my fellow microbial nerd, Amy Hollenkamp, RD.
Hello,
Are you
everybody.
glad I thought of something different to call you for one?
Yeah,
And
that was great. I like how you're mixing it up there.
I tried. You know, we're up to episode, 70-something at this point? We're going to be popping into the 80s at some point soon, so I've got to mix it up a little bit and keep it kind of real. But also, we're going to be talking about microbes on today's episode, so I figured it was apropos considering the topic. So, As always, our folks at home have already looked at the topic, they clicked on the episode, they know what it's about, but I feel like I should verbally say it anyway, in case somebody just randomly came across us and did not willingly, consciously click on the episode. But today we're going to be talking about the vaginal ecosystem. Dun, dun, dun.
The JJs.
The vajayjay. So, my darling, I'll let you kind of maybe lead us a little bit, because I think that I'm going to be spouting out the bits of factoids. So if you want to start us off, what do you know about the vaginal ecosystem? And then I'll kind of fill in the gaps.
Yeah, I would say it's not something I've dug super in the weeds on. I think that, there's other parts of the microbiome, the pH balance is really important, which I'm sure we can talk a little bit about. I know we mentioned it in the total microbial load episode? Is that before this?
Yes.
So we mentioned sort of pH balance and things that could disrupt that. So I think that that's really important to recognize, especially because there's so much that we could potentially do that would disrupt the pH balance. Because, again, whatever the pH balance is can affect what bugs grow and what bugs don't. And then the bugs themselves can help control the pH balance, too.
Bingo. Yep.
Right. So it's a weird... It's such a fine balance that I think is really important to hone in on. I think, again, in terms of the actual microbes, I think Lactobacilli are really important when it comes to the vaginal microbiome. So again, we can talk a little bit about that. And I know I'd be curious to get some of your takes on some of the specific probiotics for the vaginal microbiome. I know there's supplements like Femdophilus that have been more studied for yeast infections and things like that. Which I think are a pretty big problem for women. I think it's almost hard to find a woman that hasn't had some sort of yeast infection at some point.
Yeah.
Or again, even something like BV or bacterial vaginosis. So I'm excited to sort of dive into some of these different arrays of topics we can jump into when it comes to the vaginal microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely. This was one, I didn't really pay a lot of attention to the vaginal microbiome up until a couple years ago. And full disclosure, probably 90% of what I'm going to be sharing today is largely based off of a class from the Probiotic Advisor, so Jason Haverleck. He has a great little mini course about the vaginal microbiome and the vaginal ecosystem. And a lot of this was taken directly from that. And that's where I kind of realized that there are a lot of ways that we can help manage and control the vaginal microbiome. So full disclosure, credit due to him for sure. But you hit the nail on the head. I think that normally the hallmark of the vaginal ecosystem is that you're going to have boatloads of lactobacilli and hopefully very, very little of anything else. So there's always going to be a teensy-weensy bit of candida, a teensy-weensy bit of other types of bacteria. But hopefully in a healthy ecosystem, ironically enough, with the gut ecosystem, we talk about diversity, diversity, diversity. We want it to be a rich, teeming tropical rainforest with many different species, many different phyla, and that's the hallmark of gut ecosystem health. The vaginal ecosystem is totally different. You actually want it to be very not diverse. You want it to be made up of almost entirely lactobacilli and nothing else, which is really wild to think of because it's in stark contrast to what we talk about with the gut.
Right.
And I even before taking more of a deep dive onto this topic, I remember hearing, and I don't know if you've had patients that have done this or clients, but have you ever heard of women using yogurt vaginally, like as a suppository for yeast infections or BV?
Yes, I definitely have. I wouldn't say I could get a gauge on like whether that was super helpful in a large enough scale to where it was like,
yeah.
But yeah, it's certainly something I've heard of.
It makes a teeny bit more sense. Again, I don't know if that's really helpful. I don't think that's probably the most effective way to alter the ecosystem vaginally because we do have some probiotics, for example, that could do the job pretty well. But yeah, like I remember hearing about that at one point early on in like my hippy dippy studies. And I thought, God, that's crazy. Why would anybody do that? And now that I know that the vaginal ecosystem is supposed to be dominated by lactobacilli almost exclusively, now it kind of makes a little bit more sense. Like, oh, okay. So it might not be the exact species of lactobacillus that you want, but at least you're getting like halfway there.
Right.
Now, that being said, the species does seem to matter. So there's different ones that I might butcher the pronunciation slightly, but the absolute best player, like the MVP player, famous
James
sports. Thank you. Yeah, the
Tom
LeBron
Brady.
James, the Tom Brady, the who's the soccer guy that married Posh Spice?
Oh, David Beckham.
Yeah, the David Beckham. You know, the MVP player that everybody wants is Lactobacillus crispatus. Like, that's the really top dog in all of this. If you have an ecosystem dominated by that particular species, you're in great shape.
Yeah.
And not only that does it make lactate, which all of the lactobacilli do to some extent, but you know what's interesting? You remember maybe 4 years ago, I would estimate, in the SIBO world, there was a study that came out about D-lactic acidosis and everybody lost their goddamn mind.
Yeah.
And panicked. Yeah. So interestingly enough, and honestly, we should do a whole episode on D-lactic acidosis and D-lactate because it's a very fascinating rabbit hole to go down. But interestingly enough, it's the D-lactate that is most beneficial in the vaginal ecosystem. So you actually want bacteria that can make not only lactate, but the D isomer of lactic acid. And that's what L. crispatus does really well. It can make both the D and the L isomer, but it does make D better than the others, it seems. And that helps really regulate the pH and the environment and in the ecosystem. So that's your top dog. And I think it's about 25% of women have an ecosystem dominated by that species. So not that many. Like if you think about 25% of the female population, that doesn't paint the best picture.
Right.
That means that presumably 75% of the population is at least moderately susceptible to things like bacterial vaginosis or candida or other kind of vaginal dysbiosis situations.
Right. Or maybe their particular vaginal microbiome has to rely on other lactobacilli of some sort to control the pH. Maybe they're not quite as good, but that's really interesting that it's that low. Yeah. But it makes sense because we see it so often with people having some issues with vaginal infections. Yeah,
well, like you said, it's hard to find a woman who hasn't had at least one vaginal yeast infection. Like, it's so common. So yeah, it makes you wonder why that's so low, if it's because of, and we're going to get into this momentarily, but is it because of the widespread use of antibiotics? Is it because of things like smoking or douching or like hygiene practices? I don't know, but it is fascinatingly pretty low. Then there are other lactobacilli that live in the vaginal ecosystem as well. So there's L. gasseri, L. jenseni, I forget the pronunciation of that one, and L. inners. And you can find, so there's a probiotic with all four of these. So crispatus, gasseri, jenseni, and inners. Those are all found in a product that Jarrow makes. It's a probiotic. I think it's literally just called Jarrodophilus Women. and they have a couple of different strengths. Yeah, so I was just saying that there's a probiotic that actually has all 4 of these different bacteria in it. So it's got the L. crispatus, Gasseri, Jenseni, and Inners. And that's a probiotic made by Jarrow. It's called Jarrodophilus women, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. They have a couple of different strengths, but...
Is that the same thing as Femdophilus? Is
different.
Okay, different. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, really good question. I've used both. They both have some research on them, it seems, but this is still kind of a budding field as far as like microbial research goes. But yeah, there's... and I forget the difference between the research on them. Again, plug for Probiotic Advisor. You could type in the name of a product or the name of a probiotic species, and it'll pop up with all of the human data that is on that particular probiotic. So I don't know it off the top of my head because I just subscribe to his service. But yeah, this one's unique though because you could take it orally, right? And creepy enough, I think I shared in the Total Microbial Load episode, if you take a probiotic orally, they can find those strains elsewhere later on. So it'll show up in breast milk later on, and it'll show up in the vaginal ecosystem, even though you ingested it orally. So I don't know how the bacteria are getting down there. It's creepy to think about and really, really cool. But what's neat is that since these are the exact species that you want in the ecosystem, I've actually used this as essentially a suppository with women. So I'll have women sometimes break open a capsule or two, mix this Jarrodophilus women's probiotic with like a little bit of coconut oil or something. I usually have women make like a little tinfoil, like a mold essentially that's about the size of your pinky finger. You kind of put your pinky into the foil like this and make a mold, melt some coconut oil, mix it together with the probiotic, pour it into the little mold, pop it in the fridge so it's solid. And then you could pop like a little, 1/2 inch or 1 inch long bit of the suppository in vaginally. And then hopefully some of those will do their thing. The thing is, most likely that's going to be transient, right? Because we know from the gut microbiome that when you take probiotics, they don't normally shack up and take up permanent residence in the ecosystem. They just kind of pass through and they manipulate the ecosystem on their way through. But if you want to really get an actual transplant, you need to do FMT. So similarly, there is something called vaginal microbiota transplant. If I remember correctly, I just kind of did a quick search for it the other day for this episode. There's not a ton of research. A lot more of the research right now is like hypothesizing how you would screen the donors and like how you would go about doing it. I think I saw one study where they were doing VMT in mice. I think that they essentially gave mice either vaginal candida or BV, I forget which it was, and then they used donor microbiota transplants from humans who had healthy vaginal microbiota, if I remember correctly. So we don't really have any human data on VMT as of yet, but theoretically it would be the same kind of thing as FMT, in the sense that like you could take the probiotics either orally or vaginally perhaps, and you can affect the ecosystem to some degree. But if you want permanent residents to shack up in that ecosystem, we might be seeing more research on vaginal microbiota transplant, VMT, in the future. It seems like it's very, very new at this point.
Yeah, like they're almost still in the phase of figuring out what even makes the vaginal microbiome good, like more stable. Like they're still kind of in the early phases of that as to, again, what donors would be the best donors. But yeah, that's really interesting. I had not heard that, but it makes sense that you could potentially jump from something like an FMT to a VMT.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, heck, when I've had sinus infections in the past, this is tangentially related, but most every time I get a sinus infection now, I mess with my husband because he's a little bit more squeamish than I am. And I usually mess with him and I'll come out him with a Q-tip and be like, let me have some of your nasal microbiome. Here, come here. And he kind of runs away. It's a great thing. So, even heck, we might see like nasal microbiome transplants in the future. But the cool thing is VMT would be a heck of a lot easier to do, right? As opposed to FMT. So as far as an easy ecosystem to access, I mean, this could be really, really impactful for a lot of women, and it could be something that's pretty easily done, maybe even in like, a regular doctor's office clinical setting in a couple of decades. I'm sure we're not there yet. But I think the biggest thing is screening your donor and making sure that they, A, have the ecosystem that you would like to acquire, and, the good pH, the good species, and also screening them for STDs and making sure that you're not going to give yourself an STI willingly taking on the vaginal ecosystem of somebody else. Yeah.
Right. That would be obviously much better of an experience to rule out any of those factors.
Yes.
And I think too, we talked about it again in the total microbial load, but it's like some of the stuff that is touted for like vaginal hygiene is terrible for the pH. So
yeah.
I what is the brand? There's like a specific brand that I can't think of now. That's for, I remember a roommate in the past had it like in her bathroom, but it was like, to wash the vagina out or whatever with this specific soap that was supposed to be pH balancing, but has like perfumes and stuff. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. It's I can picture it because a lot of them have perfumes. I remember I used it for a while myself at some point, and I would get the one that's like not perfumed. I think that the Walmart version of it, like the Walmart brand, has one that's not perfumed and scented. But like stuff like that, like anything scented. Unfortunately, a lot of things that we put in vaginally, like I know diaphragms, spermicidal lubricants, a lot of stuff that we insert vaginally probably alter the ecosystem to some degree. This might sound a little bit paranoid and hippy-dippy of me, but I'll throw it out there anyway. A while back, I transitioned over to using either a menstrual cup, like a Diva cup or something like I shared a while back. I think in the pelvic floor episode, we talked about that a little bit. But I transitioned over to using a cup, or I get organic tampons on Amazon. There's a brand that like they're pretty reasonably priced. So when I do use tampons, they're organic because they spray cotton with glyphosate, and glyphosate is known to kill lactobacilli among other bacteria. And I think it kills bifido as well. So it just, out of an abundance of caution, I figured that was one of the things that I transitioned over to organic pretty early on because I realized, wait, I could be disrupting my vaginal ecosystem and causing problems just using normal tampons that might have some glyphosate residues on them. Again, I realize that's like really, really a little bit more out there, but other things that could affect the vaginal pH and the ecosystem, obviously antibiotics. I think probably the majority of women who have gotten a vaginal infection or candida infection probably have gotten one after having antibiotics. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Having multiple sexual partners also will interact with the ecosystem because unfortunately, not only so the vaginal ecosystem is supposed to be very acidic with a pH of like 3 or 4, which is pretty low, versus semen is pretty alkaline. And that's kind of intentional to neutralize the acidic pH of the vaginal ecosystem so that the sperm can survive and go fertilize the egg. But every time you have sexual intercourse, you're modifying the pH just for, like a day or two. It's going to be altered. And keep in mind that we have an ecosystem, so do men. Presumably, we don't know a ton about it yet, but the semen of men will have different types of bacteria, and it's entirely possible for your male partner to have dysbiosis. And then you're physically injecting those bacteria into your vagina. So the likelihood that that's disruptive to your ecosystem increases as you have more and more sexual partners because you're getting that much more diversity in the ecosystem. And again, diversity is not the name of the game when it comes to the vaginal ecosystem. That is a big frowny face. But yeah, I think there's the other one I want to touch on really quickly is estrogen. So, and this is again kind of bizarro, but estrogen, I forget what exactly it does, but I remember thinking that it's a little bit analogous to the 2FL thing. Are you familiar with that at all? Like the non-secretor, secretor 2FL thing?
Yep.
So you know how like people who are non-secretors, quote unquote, and guys, we'll like get to this in another episode probably, but if you're said to be a non-secretor and you have a SNP in that gene, you don't make like these little filament like anchor points for the bifido to cling onto. So you tend to lose your bifido more readily is kind of the idea. Well, similarly, when estrogen is higher, you make little anchor points for the lactobacilli to attach to so that they can stick around in the ecosystem and stay there for a longer period of time. If you have estrogen deficiency, either when you're still of menstruating age or going into menopause, then that causes dryness. And also you start to lose those attachment points. So your ability to retain your lactobacilli and give them something to hold on to starts to diminish. But of note, the same thing happens through the menstrual cycle. Like when you have your period or even a couple of days prior to your period, that's the lowest point in the menstrual cycle for estrogen. And it tends to be the area where like women who are really prone to candida or BV or vaginal dysbiosis will typically report more like itching or burning or discharge around that point. And presumably it's because the estrogen is lowest. So you're not hanging on to your lactobacilli in that moment. So they're not controlling the pH of the ecosystem as much as they normally would.
Right. No, all great points. And I think you're right. I think too, anything that like I'd be a little careful of like douching, again, like any sort of like more intense cleaning. I always laugh because even like the conventional OBGYN I go to is like the vagina is self-cleaning, like, it's sort of that mentality. Yeah. And there's supposed to be a smell there, like it's probably being produced by some of the microbes in the vagina. So I think again, like anything that's extra, like almost intense hygiene of the vagina you might want to be a little careful with, just because it could disrupt the balance of things. And again, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, probably the way to look at it, like if we're using proper terminology, which like I realize the way that most people talk about what the vagina is a little bit different than the anatomical vagina. Right. So the vagina is just the tube. Right? Like it's the tube, and then the rest of it that most people call the vagina is actually called the vulva. So I would say wash your vulva, but don't wash your vagina, if that makes sense. Like keep it all external and like the labia and everything outside, but don't clean the inside because it's gonna take care of that itself to a large degree. It is self-cleaning, and you don't want to disrupt the ecosystem and the microbiome there. Now, I will add too, at the risk of this being TMI, I am apparently very vanilla and apparently not adventurous at all, because I didn't know until I took this probiotic advisor class. Did you know that they make glitter lube? Amy's like, shit, I'm gonna out myself. I totally knew this already.
I didn't know that. But again, a lot of lubes in general sketch me out in terms of...
But glitter? Like,
yeah.
And I'm just picturing...
That's gonna be in your vagina probably till the end of time.
Yeah, until the end of time. Like, I do not understand for the life of me why that ever was invented. But yeah, like, stuff like that. Like, anything with perfumes and chemicals and glitter and scented, like, just say no. The vagina and the vulva, it's not supposed to smell like flowers. There's supposed to be pheromones, right? Like pheromones, that could be a turn on potentially. Like, it's not supposed to smell like flowers. Just leave it be. Leave the lavender at home. Don't worry about it. But yeah, I think that the combination of like bacterial metabolites, pheromones, like it's supposed to have an odor, and of note, it is supposed to have a discharge too. I didn't even realize this until I was a bit older. Like the conversation about what discharge is supposed to be present at different times of the month and what it means. Like, and I'm not an expert in this, but if you do a quick like Google search, you could probably pull something up. But there are points in the month where the vaginal discharge is a bit like thinner and clearer. And then I think it's around ovulation. They say it looks like an egg white, right? Like,
yeah, it's kind of like
thicker.
Yeah, and it's like a little bit like stringy.
Yeah.
Too, like where it's sort of, and that's, they want it to be, evolutionarily, you want it to be slippery and like kind of, because it propels the sperm better. So like when you're most fertile, your discharge is going to be most beneficial for getting the sperm to the egg.
Yeah. Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that is worth mentioning too, because because I think a lot of times we don't talk about this, and anything about the vagina, like it's so taboo to talk about anyway. But like I know, like my mom is pretty cool, and like she didn't try to make anything like secretive. But my mom never told me about, you know, what discharge is supposed to look like and what's normal and how it changes when you ovulate. Like there was no conversation about that, so I didn't know that until I was an adult. But you know, even something like that, like you could go through your life thinking that you have a recurring vaginal yeast infection that only shows up for a couple of days a month, but it could be that your discharge is changing because you ovulated and you're most fertile in that window.
Right.
So it could be, you know, since it is a bit thicker and stickier and like creamier, it could give the illusion of having an infection when it's actually not. So keep that in mind too.
Right. Such a good point. And I would say too, like if something does seem abnormal, definitely like talk to your doctor about it as well and have them culture it. I don't know if this is a common thing, but I've had some people just like treat sight unseen for something that looked like a yeast infection that was actually a bacterial issue. Yeah. And so I think sometimes that can be a little confusing too, as to how to proceed. And definitely if you think you have an issue, like I would get it cultured and not just sort of treat willy-nilly. Unless, again, it's something that you've historically had and you know exactly what it is. But even in those cases, it's still probably good to get cultured when you feel like there's an issue going on so that they know exactly if it's more bacterial or if it's more fungal. But just an FYI.
And I'm glad you brought that up because there is this distinct tone. You know, for a number of years now, we've been saying that overusing antibiotics is bad, right? Right. Like, oh, you kill off the good and the bad bacteria simultaneously, so we shouldn't be overusing antibiotics and we can develop resistance, et cetera, right? Like that's been somewhere talked about for a good 20 years or so, like into the 2000s. But there's been a distinct kind of tone where like, oh, but antifungals, you could use those, no harm, no foul. But I might have brought this up in the Candida episode way back when, but now there's some beginnings of research that suggests that fungal dysbiosis is a thing and that disrupting the balance of the good and the bad fungi can also be a bad thing and do weird, wonky things to your body. So similarly, you know, there a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm just going to take, the name a name. I don't know.
Diflucan, fluconazole.
Thank you. Yeah, like I'm just going to take the diflucan and no harm, no foul. It's totally harmless. It's not like an antibiotic, whatever. It's like, that's not precisely true at this point. Like we think that we might actually be disrupting the good fungi as well. And we need to research that a bit more. So similarly, like you don't want to treat something inappropriately, first of all, because it's not going to correct the problem. If you have BV, but you treat it as Candida, you're not going to get rid of the BV. But also you need to think about it from the perspective of, well, I don't want to take an antifungal unnecessarily in a similar way. I don't want to take an antibiotic unnecessarily. So you really want to get an appropriate diagnosis.
Right.
I would say as a rule of thumb, like what they'll say if you read up on this or if you go to a textbook, usually candida infections are said to be itchy with a thick white discharge, and you might smell a smell that smells like yeast or bread.
Right.
On occasion. I've had vaginal yeast infections. I've never once thought it smelled like bread. Ever. But like that's what they say. Versus bacterial vaginosis is said to have a little bit more of a colored tinge to the discharge, like a yellowish or a greenish color. And it's supposed to smell more fishy as opposed to like yeasty. Now again, like how blatant and obvious that is going to vary from person to person, but you know, theoretically you might be able to get a rough idea of what it is before you get a culture, but I do think it's worthwhile to get a culture and just try to find out what you're dealing with before you go in and treat it willy-nilly.
Well, and I think what's interesting too about the diflucan, or again the antifungals too, is it seems like the conventional space is pretty, and I know we've talked about this, conservative with it, meaning that if you went in for a yeast infection, they might be like, oh, here's 1 to 3 days of the diflucan. Whereas like sometimes functional medicine providers are like, here, take this diflucan for 2 months.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, what? Like, it's such a long time. So it's interesting to me, the dichotomy across different medical providers and how they're looking at it. Because again, the conventional space, what I've seen with people that get yeast infections, it's like, here, take this diflucan for 1 to 3 days. It will calm things down. Whereas like for the functional space, it's like just a pretty long period of time in comparison to what the... Right.
Yeah. And I think that, you know what, I think there's 2 factors that are at play there, because that's a really, really accurate observation, I think. A, you know why the conventional space is so concerned with antifungals? They don't give a shit about fungal dysbiosis. Like they don't, I probably even know
maybe
the liver enzymes. Yeah. And I remember I wanted to scream. Like I went in a few years ago when my daughter started preschool, we were hit by the preschool germs, which were intense. I went in cocky. I was like, I take vitamin D and elderberry. I'll be good. No. They took over my body. My mom and Mike and I were all sick consistently for like 3 months. Just never got well. And thank God this was pre-pandemic, because we would have been COVID testing ourselves every other day. But we were so sick, and I had a cough that had lingered for like weeks and weeks. And finally my mom was, so I'm an only child and I have a very overprotective, loving mother, but she kind of like, she posed this idea to me that you have to go to urgent care. What if you have pneumonia? Your daughter needs her mother. Like almost posing it like you could die. And I was like, whoa, okay, I guess I'll go get it checked out, Mom. Fine. And I went in. The nurse practitioner did the most half-assed exam I've ever seen in my entire life. I told her not once but twice, I do not want antibiotics. I will take them if you think they're absolutely necessary, but I really don't want antibiotics. I'm not here to seek pills. Like, just tell me what's going on. And if I need like a chest x-ray or something. And she prescribed me doxycycline, presumably because I had something bacterial, which I'll come back in a minute. But I asked her, I said, oh, if I'm going to be on doxy for 10 days or whatever it was, can I please get a prescription for diflucan? This was before I knew about the fungal dysbiosis thing. But I said, can I please get a prescription for diflucan? And that way, if I get a vaginal yeast infection, I'll have that at the ready. And you would have thought I asked her for 8-ball crack cocaine. Like, she was aghast. She was doling out the prescription for the doxycycline like nobody's business, did not care at all. But when I brought up diflucan, she was like, well, you know, there's a risk that your liver enzymes will go up. But she did this like, oh, this could be really bad and it could make your liver enzymes go up and oh my gosh. And okay, I'll write you a prescription for 1 dose. That's it. But I'm really worried about your liver enzymes. And again, I'm like, lady, it'll be fine. Meanwhile, I later figured out that based on the handouts she gave me, that she gave me an antibiotic for what she ultimately diagnosed as viral bronchitis. So I didn't even need the antibiotic anyway. But she was willing to give that out like candy, like no problem whatsoever. But the diflucan, you would have thought I asked for heroin, the way she looked at me. So, yeah, I've definitely noticed that. But I also think that the functional and like naturopathic space is very, very, very fearful of candida. And like candida is a very common boogeyman for the functional professionals. And I think that they probably are overdiagnosing it to some degree, to be honest. So I think it's just like, that's one of the boogeymen of choice is candida. And then they want to, they kind of want to like treat it because it's such a scary boogeyman to them. And they want to like paint the picture of, oh, this is serious. You need this for 2 months. Oh my God. Here, take 1 million supplements with it too. So I think it's a combination of like our professions being really fearful of candida and on the witch hunt for candida much more so. And then the conventional space being really fearful of the whole liver enzyme thing.
Right. I think that is very accurate. What else do we have to cover?
Well, I'll throw this out there, just a couple more nuggets. Again, it's a relatively small ecosystem, so we knew this would be a relatively short episode anyway.
And I have one other thing too, when you finish some of your nuggets.
Okay. So I have 2. With regards to HPV, did you know that an acidic environment inhibits HPV?
I did not know that. That's super interesting.
Yeah. So as an example, a good friend of mine, she has HPV and she has had some abnormal PAPs. Like not urgent, oh my God, we need to do something right now, but to the point where it's like, it's not normal, we're going to watch it, come back in a year or something like that. And she freaked out. And I shared some of this information with her, and she started doing what she called vag bombs, which I'll get to in a second. But she was using some vaginal prebiotics and some of the probiotics, like I was saying, making little suppositories. And between that, and she also pulled up some research that a deficiency of folate or B12 and like basically like sluggish methylation can also be associated with HPV, virulence, I guess. Right. So she got back on track with her B vitamins and she started doing what she called vag bombs. And at her next checkup, 6 months later or whatever it was, totally normal PAP, and they've been normal ever since. So, dang. Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. We don't have a ton of research on like using this specifically, but I think that it's really promising. And that brings me into the other thing I wanted to touch on really quickly. So for the vag bombs, again, her name, not mine. So she would do the probiotics, like I said, the little suppositories. And there are 2 prebiotics that seem to really, really feed the lactobacilli. And importantly, they do not feed candida. So you could use these either orally or potentially use them vaginally. And they seem to be very effective for that. One of them is lactulose, believe it or not. And we know this from the gut ecosystem that lactulose feeds bifidobacteria, it feeds lactobacilli, it seems to feed Akkermansia. But similarly, if you could feed the vaginal lactobacilli with some lactulose, then you could get some prebiotic in there. You could feed the good guys, inhibit the bad guys, normalize the pH. Everybody's off skipping in the rainbows. And lactulose, for all that it's a sugar, candida won't touch the stuff. So you're not going to feed any sort of candida. The other one is green tea. So usually what I'll have patients do, and again, Jason Harlech talks about this in his course, so I'm not going to give away all of the details here, but because it's like a $50 course, it's totally worth doing. But he recommends mixing a little bit of warm organic green tea with a little bit of lactulose, mixing it up, and then inserting that vaginally. And then doing that, I think like he says to do it once a day for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, and then like every other day for another week or 2. And that should right the ecosystem, assuming that you have the bacteria to feed. If you don't have any of these good bacteria left, then you can't feed them because they're gone. Right? Like we can't leave out dinosaur food to bring back the dinosaurs. It's kind of like that. Right. So if that's the case, if they're genuinely gone, then you would need to do something like VMT, presumably. But if you have low levels of the ideal bacteria and you just need to feed them, some combination of green tea or lactulose or both can be really, really helpful. So that's what my friend used. She did the green tea and the lactulose, and then she would do the probiotics with the Gyrodophilis women, and she got back on her B vitamins, and her HPV, her pap smears have been normal ever since. And that was probably about 4 years ago, because I think that was before she had her son. And he's 3 now.
That's really interesting, again, about green tea and the lactulose. I've never heard that at all. But I'd imagine, again, like prebiotics is such an interesting strategy too, especially inserting directly. I'm sure that there's some relation between what you're doing orally and what happens in the vaginal microbiome. And again, that's kind of something too I'd be curious to ask you, because I think, you have a lot of times when I work with women, it's like they have a really strong vaginal fungal infection history. Mm-hmm. Does it potentially raise the risk of microbiome microbiome fungal dysbiosis of some sort? Yes. Which again, like, is certainly something to look out for too. Again, if you've had like one vaginal yeast infection or something, and it was a long time ago, and that's sort of like your only evidence of that I have yeast in my gut and I have to address it. Sometimes, again, I see that too. Yeah. But if you have a really strong history of just like really struggling to get the vaginal microbiome controlled, you probably have some gut stuff going on too. And you should at least be assessed for maybe having some fungal stuff going on gut-wise.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the history, if there's like a woman who has vaginal yeast infections, yearly or a couple times a year, or if it's just recurrent all the time, like I would treat anyway. Because I have seen some human data on this. Right. The numbers that I've seen, I think, are close to a 90% occurrence rate, meaning if you have chronic vaginal yeast infections, there's about a 90% chance that you also have a candida infection or overgrowth in your gut.
Right.
And this is something, actually, this has been a major project of mine on the back burner for my YouTube channel for a long time, which is trying to tackle the best way to test for yeast.
Yeah.
Because I hypothesize right now that stool tests probably underestimate the prevalence of candida, and we cannot measure for it in the small bowel, right? Like, because stool testing does not equal small bowel. So CFO is kind of a total crapshoot. Likewise, if you have candida overgrowth in the stomach or the esophagus, we can't really tell. Thrush, we can see that on the tongue. But then, so with stool testing, I think it underestimates candida. But then we have things like the organic acids test, which is a urine test. And I kind of think that they overdiagnose candida because honestly, I've run a lot of oat tests over the years and I've only seen it come back totally negative for any sort of yeast overgrowth, like twice. So I get hella suspicious when I see a pattern like that.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I've been a little suspect of the oat test too, unless someone's like crazy high. And I almost think like when I've talked to some of the people at Great Plains, I've been sort of surprised by some of their analysis because like by looking at the data, like sometimes they're like, I wouldn't do anything really like aggressive unless it was at this point. So like a couple times when I've actually talked to the Great Plains people too, it's been interesting to hear what sort of interventions they would recommend based on where the numbers are falling. So I think maybe the cutoff for, I don't know, you could use like arabinose, for example, is like 30 or something like that. And like, I remember one time I talked to someone at Great Plains and they were like, I wouldn't really do anything super aggressive until that's a 50 or 60. Like, which is, again, it's just interesting to hear that.
Yeah, and the weird thing about it is the way that they set up that test, so you end up getting this like orangish yellow box, and then you have this like whisker hair thing on the end with little lines at the end, right? And if you're past the little tiny vertical line on the far right-hand side, like well past the orange box, that means that you are in like the 97th percentile. Because it's a bell curve. They tell you later on in the handout that it's a bell curve, and they're going off of the standard deviation. So if you're between the midpoint and the edge of the orange box, that's one standard deviation. If you're between the edge of the orange box and that whisker hair thing on the end, that's between the first and second standard deviation. And if you're beyond the top end of their range, which is essentially the second standard deviation, if you're beyond that, you're past the second standard deviation, which most of the time in statistics, we would consider statistically significant. And for a normal bell curve analysis, that means you're in the top 97.5, or I'm sorry, it would mean that your value is higher than 97.5% of the tested individuals.
Right.
So like automatically, if it's out of the range, it feels like that should be significant. So again, like it's really confusing that like the way that their test is set up, that they would say that, because you would think that anybody that's above their range would automatically be like really, really super yeasty.
Yeah, and I wonder too, and again, I don't know where they're getting their data set. That's the control where everything's being based off of, in their statistical analysis. But I wonder too a little bit about like some of the fungal contaminants that are in food, that like could just be found in food too, that show up on the test. So again, I think you're right. There's probably not necessarily like the most perfect fungal test at this point. And I think you're right. The stool tests underestimate. So sometimes when I see it showing up on the stool test and it's consistent with other things, it's like, well, this is definitely probably an issue. But again, it doesn't necessarily totally rule someone out if it's not showing up. Sometimes, honestly, with fungal stuff, if we suspect it and there's kind of other signs and symptoms, treating it and seeing how someone responds can be kind of interesting too. It's almost like more the idea of experimenting to actually confirm or didn't reject a hypothesis. Well,
and it goes back to and I do that quite a lot too. I treat empirically for yeast moderately frequently, especially when you're using something like caprylic acid or SF722. Like I think that those are pretty safe and pretty well tolerated to the point where you could use them a little bit more willy-nilly than like a diflucan, for example. But yeah, it's like anything else, there is no such thing as a perfect test, but it's all a spectrum. Like some tests are closer to perfection and some tests are really, really, really far away from being perfect. And yeast testing across the board, I think, is probably the furthest you can be from perfection. And like SIBO tests are right behind it, right? So it's like those are the two where, try to get some data, but also go into it knowing that the data is going to be imperfect. And usually, like if I'm treating for this, if I'm suspicious, I will say, hey, let's do like a GI map or a stool test, for example. If it comes back positive with yeast, we'll take it to the bank and we'll run with it. If it comes back negative, it still really sounds like yeast could be a problem for you. We might treat empirically anyway. Here's how we would go about doing that. So that's usually more of the conversation. And similarly with SIBO testing, we'll do the SIBO test and I'll tell people like, look, there's X amount of rate of positives, false negatives and false positives. But generally, I'm willing to believe a positive test if I see one. So, if it's positive, great, we'll treat it. If it's negative, it still really sounds like you have SIBO, so we're probably going to treat empirically anyway, but it can be nice to have the data, especially if you think you're going to get to a point where you want a prescription. So for example, even with lactulose is a prescription. So treating the vaginal ecosystem to bring it back around, it might be nice to have the culture or the testing to back up your hypothesis of chronic vaginal yeast infection. And that way, when you bring this to your OBGYN or whoever and say, hey, can you write me a prescription for lactulose because I want to put it in my vagina? They're not going to look at you like you're totally insane. Like, at least they're going to be in the know that, oh, yes, we've confirmed this diagnosis with a culture test multiple times. I get it. Sure. And I have actually had OBGYNs and PCPs write a prescription for lactulose specifically with the understanding that it's going to be used vaginally. It's really cheap. Yeah. It's really safe. Usually, like when I'm working with a patient and we're doing this, I will fax a letter over to their doctor explaining why we want to do this. I'll share a couple of PubMed studies that I'm basing my hypothesis on, and I'll ask them, pretty please with sugar on top, will you write the prescription for lactulose? And I have had some say, yes, that's fine, and they've done it. But yeah, you want to have that data if you can get it, because then that kind of helps your conventional medical team buy into it a little bit more and understand what you're doing, instead of you being like the hippy dippy crazy person who's just putting weird things in your vagina hoping to correct a candida infection that's never been confirmed. Right. Yeah. I have one more topic vaginally to discuss. Now, remind me, my darling, as of the recording of this episode, how far are you in your pregnancy?
I am 20-ish weeks.
Okay. So I think you've
got
the
gender soon.
Oh, yes. I will be very anxious to know what type of nugget you're growing.
Is it a P or a V? That's what we're going to figure out.
Yes. So that being said, I think that this will come up later. I think it's closer to the 30-week mark, or it might even be later, like 35. I can't swear to it. Has your OB brought up the topic of Group B Streptococcus yet? Group B Strep?
Not yet. Not yet.
Are you at all familiar?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this was... Basically, I remember learning about this. Like, I was doing an orientation, meet and greet with the birth center, and they brought this up, and they said, yeah, about 20 or 25% of all pregnant women will test positive for Group B strep, and if that is the case, then we recommend giving you antibiotics during your labor. And I was like, what?
Right.
Like, I'm at a birth center. I came here because I want to do things naturally. Oh, hell to the no. No. And I'm like immediately texting my friend who's an OBGYN in California. I'm like, Christy, tell me more about this. Oh my God. And basically it's just vaginal dysbiosis. Right. It's an overgrowth of streptococci, Group B strep. And again, the hallmark of vaginal health is that the ecosystem is super not diverse. Right. And it's totally dominated by lactobacilli. So if you have those healthy lactobacilli, they should presumably crowd out any of the streptococci, and those Group B strep shouldn't be able to hunker down. But if you think about it, what do we say? 25% of the female population has like the best ecosystem dominated by L. crispatus, and then 75% have either like a super diverse, unhealthy ecosystem or a different type of lactobacilli that's dominating it, which would be a little bit less stable. So it makes sense that then about 25% of pregnant women test positive for the Group B strep, but they recommend doing antibiotics during labor because it can cause, I think it's like eye infections in the newborn, because again, they're getting bathed in your vaginal microbiome on the way out. But similarly, if you're a woman who has a really strong history of vaginal yeast infections or BV, or if you have a hunch that you have vaginal dysbiosis, you might want to tend to that and focus on your gut health and focus on trying to normalize your vaginal microbiome before you get pregnant, because then hopefully you're going to set the stage for not testing positive for Group B strep, and then you don't have to go through all of that hassle and all of that kerfuffle.
Right. Good point. That'll be interesting. I'm someone that doesn't have a strong history of yeast infections, as far as I know. Again, I haven't had any outright major issues. So hopefully, maybe my vaginal microbiome's looking good. But maybe I could take a little bit of like some vaginal support for a period of time before before I get tested for Group B stuff.
Well, or I'll pose this too. You can actually test the vaginal microbiome. Did you know that?
I did not.
There are a couple of tests. I actually just sent one out from each company myself because I was curious and I wanted to see what the reports looked like.
Right.
And I'll probably do a YouTube video on it, looking at the reports and comparing them. But there are 2 companies in the US that I came across, and there's another one in development right now, but they haven't launched it yet. One of them is called Juno Bio. So it's Juno, like the movie, Juno.bio, I think is the website. Mm-hmm. That one was good. The thing that I liked, it's a teensy bit more expensive. I think that Juno Bio is $129, and the other company, Evie, is I think $99 or $100. So Juno is a little bit more expensive, but it also came with an applicator to measure your pH. So part of the process is they have you fill out a questionnaire, but they also had you measure the pH with like a little pH strip. And you record that as part of the process, which I thought was a nice added bonus.
Right.
So Juno Bio does the microbiome and the pH. Evie, or Evie, it's EVVY. They just do the microbiome analysis. Both of them were easy to do. I just did them recently. I'm waiting on the test reports to come back in. They were both very, very easy, very intuitive. I thought that Evie had more intuitive instructions than Juno Bio. And the Juno Bio had the pH measurement, but not the other company. But those were the major differences I've seen so far. But like I said, I haven't seen the reports come back, but I'm really curious to see like what they can measure. I don't even know if they can measure Candida, for example, if that's something that's on there, or if it's just bacteria, because I think there are 16S tests, if I remember correctly, which presumably means they won't measure Candida. But yeah, I'll have to fill you in when I get one of those back. But I think they said the turnaround time is like 2 or 3 weeks. So if you order one now, you could have it in before you even get tested for Group B Strep if you're really curious.
Oh, cool. Get a little down low what's going on down there.
And then we can compare notes. We can talk about our ecosystems together. Maybe not on the podcast, but we can have a private conversation about what critters we harbor.
Yep, I bet everyone's jealous that they're not in on that private
I know that
combo.
They're not in that conversation. No, but I will raise
not privy enough.
No, that's an insider exclusive. I'm only sharing that with Amy. Actually, no, that's a lie. I will tell my husband, but he won't think it's that cool. He'll be like,
right. He'll be like, you're up to your weird stuff again.
Pretty much, yeah. I did brag about my pH, actually. When I did the test collection, later that day, I told him, I was like, not going to brag, but my pH was 4. Yeah, but like, when I say I'm not going to brag, that's me saying I'm going to brag. So I was like, not going to brag, but my pH was 4. Or, it only measured down to 4, so it could have been lower and I wouldn't know. But he was like, cool, thanks.
Right. Sweet brag.
Yeah, so never a dull moment in the Daneza household. But I had one more thing, realizing this is a little scattery now, but I had one more thing I wanted to sneak in this episode. Did I tell you that I gave myself a vaginal yeast infection doing a damn glucose-based SIBO test?
You told me this, yeah.
I just want to reiterate this. So, Candida loves glucose. Specifically, it doesn't really give a flying crap about fructose so much, and it won't really do anything with lactulose, which is good news. But the glucose-based SIBO test, I am very, very reluctant to order a glucose-based test for SIBO anymore because it wrecked my blood sugar and it wrecked my vaginal ecosystem for a couple of days. And I think I took some probiotics and did some stuff to kind of right the ship again. But I was very shocked that happened because I wouldn't consider myself high risk or super vulnerable for vaginal yeast infections. Yeah. But when I did this test, I did the Aerodiagnostics one at the time. This was a few years ago. They literally give you like 3/4 of a cup of what looks like granulated table sugar. And then you add it to water and you chug it. I got, at the end of the test, so like 3 hours after that, I got wicked hypoglycemic. And I was shaking. I was sweating. I had a pounding headache. I was kind of lightheaded. Like, I just barely made it to the end of the test. I actually had to cancel my appointments for the rest of the afternoon. Like, I couldn't function. I just like took a nap for the rest of the day, and I ate some other food, obviously. But yeah, I was like out of commission for a couple of hours because my blood sugar just crashed and burned on me. And then the following day, I had a vaginal yeast infection, and I was like, oh, no. So what you eat and the sugar that you ingest can definitely affect that ecosystem. And I did end up having to take, some, I forget, like caprylic acid or whatever it might have been.
Right.
But yeah, it was a pretty wild thing to realize that. I mean, I knew that the glucose tests were contraindicated in people who have blood sugar problems. But now, in my opinion, they should be contraindicated in people who have a strong history of yeast infections or who have a high suspicion of it. And again, it makes you wonder, because they say about 40% of people who have SIBO also have SIFO, right?
Right.
And then we're testing with glucose. I don't know if that's really such a good idea.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's problems.
Yeah.
That's
#problems.
Yeah.
As the kids would say. Yeah. But I think that being said, I think we're clocking in right about an hour. So relatively short episode for us. But I think that I'm officially out of ideas for what to talk about with the vaginal ecosystem. Unless you have any other tidbits to share, but I think that I covered all the bases I sought to in this particular episode.
Yeah, I think we're all good from my end.
Moral of the story, guys. Just say no to glitter lubricant. Just say no. It's a bad idea. You're going to be finding glitter in there for the rest of your life. Nobody wants to see that. There's got to be better ways of beautifying that area of your body. Stay away from glitter. But as always, this was a weird topic, certainly. But again, total microbial load. Like, this all makes sense in the context of the gut in some ways. The two ecosystems are definitely connected. And ultimately, if you can do things holistically to manage your vaginal ecosystem so that you don't have to take antibiotics or antifungals, that is going to spare your gut microbes and cause fewer problems for your gut if you can avoid taking unnecessary medication. So hopefully you all see the relevance of why we wanted to talk about the vaginal ecosystem for an hour today. But as always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple or iTunes podcast, I forget which it's called. Leave us a comment down below on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up, click subscribe, and we will see you next time in the next episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. Take care.